Let me tell you what I'm going to talk about to you today, this morning, this first hour of the conference. I'm going to tell you a bit about the background that constitutes where the medicalization of homosexuality and other gender and sexual non-normative categories began, what its genesis was, and how it still lingers with us today. To that end, if starting around 10, we're really going to start to groove in the 70s with what happened here in terms of thinking about the removal of homosexuality as a term of mental aberration, the push towards trying to demedicalize homosexuality and other categories of gender and sexual non-normativity. I'm going to give you the history before that. Before I do that, let me just start to introduce myself a little bit further. My background is that I'm a historian of medicine as well as a medical ethicist and a queer theorist. So I have PhDs in English, specializing in queer studies and the history of medicine. So my interest is thinking about the textual and the political legacies of LGBT identity, particularly through the lens of the history of medicine. Before I take us back to something like the late 19th century, let me start with this quote. This is a quote that comes from 1987. If this afternoon is when we're going to get to talking about AIDS and its impact on the LGBT community, let me start with a quote by this author. If you've all heard of Edmund White, Edmund White is a leading author of part of the lavender quill scene that was of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today. He writes very semi-autobiographical fiction, as in it's all about him and his friends and his life. He just changes the names. The stories remain the same. This is a quote that he gave, though, in an essay he wrote in 1987 called Ethics and Loss. And what I want you to be mindful of here is not so much the dates, but the notion of trajectory. To have been oppressed in the 50s, freed in the 60s, exalted in the 70s, wiped out in the 80s is a quick itinerary for a whole culture to follow. For we are witnessing not just the death of individuals, but a menace to an entire culture. All the more reason to bear witness to this cultural moment. Now, here, White is gesturing towards basically the idea of where did gay rights and LGBT liberation come after, say, the 1960s? How in the 1970s did we find this moment of really galvanized political action, both on medical fronts and political fronts, to the point where by the 70s you're almost being exalted? And of course, along comes an epidemic like HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, which suggests a kind of epidemiological, if not political, kind of disaster on a community. That trajectory from the valley to the heights back down to the valley again is a very quick one over the course of a couple of decades. But quite frankly, and I say this as a historian, I'm going to give you the kind of sentence a historian would use. The notion of thinking about homosexuality is quite recent. It's only about 125 years old. Only a historian would say something like it's only 125 years old. But that's a quick itinerary to follow also. An itinerary with which categories like homosexuality, bisexuality, transsexualism, transvestitism, transgenderism are terms that were very much categorized and created in science and medicine, but not that long ago. So to think about attempting to liberate them from these categories in the 60s and 70s, only to see people returning to medicine in the 80s because of an epidemic, and today still to be fraught with the responsibilities of medicalization and pathologization, that's a quick itinerary to follow. So let's start with a quote. It's perhaps one of the most famous in the history of sexuality studies. It comes from Michel Foucault's work, The History of Sexuality. He's referring to the creation of a term like homosexual. He says, and by the way, if you want to know the fact about that term did not exist before the end of the 1860s. It did not exist. There was no term for homosexual. Second, I'll tell you what that other term used to be, and that's sodomy. That's what we usually talk about. So the very notion of homosexuality was coined at the end of the 19th century. Homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from the practice of sodomy into a kind of interior androgyny, a hermaphrodism of the soul. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. Now let me walk through some of the details on this. When he says that the homosexual versus the sodomite, he's talking about the differences between pathology, which is what the homosexual is, versus sodomy, which is what the offender is, the criminal or the sinner in some way. Historically, across time, across geographies, across cultures, the idea that two guys or two girls or a bunch of people could get it on, or that somebody wouldn't identify with the gender they were first ascribed, those notions have existed as long as people have been around. But the idea that you could diagnose somebody because of who they were attracted to or what their gender identity felt like or they expressed, that's something that was coined at the end of the 19th century. Now, historically then, we had sodomy, which was typically understood either in two categories, and we can call these juridical categories or judgmental categories. The first is according to the axiom of sin. Here's a classic example. This is, of course, not limited to any other one, but this is one from Leviticus about if a man lies with a man as he does with a woman, surely he has committed an abomination. I think we've all, if not read this one before, if you've been to a gay pride march, certainly there's some objective protester there holding Leviticus 20:13, a quote of it up or something. But this is a juridical model, a model that says two persons of the same gender or the same sex attracted to one another or acting on that attraction, that is an offense at the level of sin. Our second model might be something like crime. This is the first law in England, in an English-speaking world. It's the Buggery Act of 1533. Buggery was sort of one of the terms, again, for the act of having two men sort of get it on. Basically, this was put forward in the reign of Henry VIII by Thomas Cromwell, who was the head of the House of Commons. This is just an example. Now, these date from various time periods, thousands, if not hundreds, if not thousands of years apart, but the juridical models of sin and crime tend to have been the axes of how, if there was an offense to same-sex affection or gender nonconformity, these were the ways. So Foucault talks about the homosexual coming, this term being generated at the end of the 19th century, as changing the name of the game, changing it from being something temporary aberration to something that's more specieshood. A change from religion and law to science, from practice to personhood. In fact, here's a good breakdown of how this works. On the left-hand side, you see a juridical model for how same-sex affection or gender non-normativity has been historically understood throughout times and cultures. Historically, it was called sodomy or some version. On the right-hand side is our diagnostic sort of model, which is where the term homosexuality, and by the way, like I said, you could take out the term homosexuality and put in transsexuality or hermaphroditism or bisexuality or transvestitism. These all are terms that came out of fields of science, sexology specifically. So the differences are between sodomy and homosexuality, the juridical and the medical, the religious and the legal versus the scientific and the medical, between thinking about sin and crime as the axes for gender and sexual non-normativity, or sickness, the difference between performing an offense or having a pathology, and the solution as being the difference between providing penance or punishment, do 10 Hail Marys, do a bunch of rosaries, burn in hell, whatever the solution might be, or go to the gallows, stay in jail, pay a fine. These are penance and punishment related when it's sodomy. And when it's homosexuality, the solution is cure. If the sodomy model is temporary, that's the word Foucault says, then the diagnostic model is entrenched. The juridical model is what I did. So the model of sodomy says, whether or not I got it on with another guy last Saturday night, the action is the thing that's important. The diagnostic model says it's who you are. It's a difference between practice and personhood. So that's why Foucault would say something like, it goes from a temporary aberration, oops, sin, oops, crime, oops, offense, to actually being what he calls now a species. It makes up who you are. To that end, one other important thing to note about Foucault is this is something that he says also about how we understand sexuality. His first opening lines of this text that he writes are called from a chapter called We Other Victorians. By the way, that word other is being used there as a play on words. He's using it to say that on the one hand, we, and if you use other as a verb, we tend to call people Victorian, and literally the Victorians themselves as though they were somehow prude, and therefore we distance ourselves from them. We other them. On the other hand, he's saying that we are like the Victorians, though. We are maybe perhaps just as prude as they might be. So in other words, we are the other Victorians in some way. He's basically saying that for a long time, the story goes, we supported a Victorian regime, and we continue to be dominated by it today. Thus, the image of the imperial prude is emblazoned in our restrained, mute, and hypocritical sexuality. What I want you to know is that it would be easy to historicize the pathologization of LGBT persons as simply an artifact of a late 19th century concept or of an early 20th century tendency, something that perhaps was liberated in the 70s with the removal of homosexuality from a diagnostic manual. But with the rise of HIV and AIDS, with the resurrection of what makes people gay in hormonal and genetic and anatomical studies, to a host of other subjects, we today are in some ways haunted by the legacies of pathology as connected to LGBT history, maybe as much as the past was. To be honest with you, that's why I have a job that I have. I'm a historian, but I work in a department of medical ethics because I ask, What are the things that we're experiencing on the ground floor, on the front lines of medicine and treating LGBT persons that in many ways are lingering aftershocks of this history of medicine that has in large part pathologized and marginalized queer and LGBT persons? Note those words Victorian. In the American model, we tend to say the puritanical, but note that word mute also, since what we're talking about here in many ways is a kind of attention to gender and sexual non-normativity in medicine that oscillates between the heavily discursive, the heavily talking about, and the restrained or silent. To that end, there's an intimidating specter for medicine and the biosciences for LGBT persons. Are science and medicine our advocates or our foes? Our liberators or our pathologizers? Our healers or our eradicators? And there's cases to be made for any or all of these categories. Let me walk you through a few important figures in the history of medicine. I'm just going to gesture on them ever so slightly because I know you're going to be hearing about a few of them more throughout the day. Less interested in you knowing the details of all of these biographical sort of men of science. After all, I'm a social historian of medicine, so my interest is usually quite often more what's it like for everyday people rather than touting who are the great men of science. But I'll introduce you to a few. The first is perhaps the one who really first propelled scientific appreciations of homosexuality in particular. Interestingly, he was no medical man himself. He was a legal scholar by the name of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. The important thing to note is that he advocated for legal reform of same-sex affection in Germany in the middle to late part of the 19th century. He facilitated the prominence of a term like homosexual, or the one that he labeled, which was called yearning, an Urning, or a Uranian. This is sort of a classical term that he used for men who are attracted to men. His text, Studies of the Riddle of Male-Male Lovers, is probably his most famous work. Note that his significance is that he's one of the first people to coin these phrases and use them, and he does it in legal scholarship. But he does it in legal scholarship as a scientifically and medically articulated defense of these categories. So his is a request for a scientific and a medical appreciation of same-sex affection. He's not the first in the world to do this kind of thing. So for example, I'll give you three good examples. In the sort of early part of the 19th century, the famous public health and social advocate in England, Jeremy Bentham, was somebody who argued and articulated for the decriminalization of homosexuality laws. After the French Revolution in the first decades of the 19th century, the federal government in France actually repealed laws against homosexual activity and acts. They would later reinstate them during subsequent Napoleonic Wars, but in the spirit of the French Revolution, they felt that these were unnecessary sort of laws. Even the Quakers in this area of Pennsylvania were some of the first people who advocated in the United States for the decriminalization of homosexuality. The difference with Ulrichs, of course, is the fact that he's operating within law and he's doing it in support of same-sex affection. Those other instances I mentioned in post-revolutionary France or Jeremy Bentham in early 19th century England or even the Quakers in America would have been advocates less for advocacy than more so for tolerance. As in, not that we need to protect rights, but we don't necessarily need to punish, might have been the logic in those other instances. Ulrichs, however, is advocating for a medical appreciation of these desires, to liberate them in some way from the juridical, to take them out of punishment and sin, and to say something like this. And by the way, a lot of these people who I'm going to show you were the early sexologists and workers on the field were people that we would now call retrospectively queer in some way. Their sexuality or their gender was in some ways not necessarily cisgender typical, and Karl Ulrichs was one of these people. The logic behind their advocacy then was something very well intended, and we know how the road to hell is paved, right? Well intended, with the logic of something like, if I'm talking to somebody who would have been described as a sodomite, with this new scientific appreciation, you are not a sinner, you are not a criminal, you didn't do anything wrong. You just have a condition. Is what it would have said. And of course, what we've done then with the "you just have a condition" is hopefully taken away the judgmental, but we certainly have not stripped the stigma, because we've taken away the idea of doing an infraction and merely made you some kind of pathological anomaly. Let me give you some examples. This is from a novel that was circulated in Paris and London, and I'm going to give you a couple of artistic and literary examples because that's the world I inhabit as a scholar. There was a famous text. It was called Telony or the Reverse of the Medal, and it's attributed to Oscar Wilde and others. Here's the fun part about this text, and I love this text. It's basically a semi-pornographic sort of novel that Gaiman would read, I'm showing you images and illustrations from a recent graphic novel interpretation, but the original book was just prose. And in a really fun kind of literary twist in terms of multi-authorship, the text could be found at one of two bookshops that catered in literature for men in particular who had proclivities for other men. And you could find this book in a manuscript form at either a bookstore in Paris or in London. Your job was to check out the book, to read it, and when you got to the end, to add another chapter, or add another few paragraphs, or add some more text. So this is why it's attributed to, we know Oscar Wilde had it in his possession at some time, and there are certain chapters where it seems to have Wildean sort of flair. Particularly as you're reading it, you might be like, well, this is really bad writing. Wow, this got really good. Nope, it's back to shitty again. Yep, so as you know, there's lots of authors. But part of that then also means is that what you've got here is a collective form of readership and writing, a text that attributes to the ways with which people could see reflections of themselves, either because of the fact that they appreciated what other people wrote, or they added some themselves. So it's a wonderful example of multi-authorship. The story is basically, like I said, a story of various escapades and conquests of all different varieties, sexual and exploitative and different hedonistic sort of things happening at that particular time. The climax of the novel, sort of just before, I'd say the last sort of maybe couple chapters, takes place when there's people attending a kind of like a party, an orgiastic sort of feast or whatever, and they're basically just coupling off or what have you. The thing to note that happens is that in the heat of this very erotic sort of novel, where basically the point is for people to sort of get turned on by reading this account, the story turns very tragic in one of these scenes, because what happens is that one of the men is injured. He's injured rectally in the sense that he's bleeding and needs medical attention. So in a very swift way, the movie goes from, the story goes from escalating erotically to suddenly there's injury and suddenly someone's in trouble. This is the prose around the man, as you can see lying in bed. This is, again, the graphic illustration. I'll read it for you. Dr. Charles sent for his instruments. Dr. Charles is one of their friends who was at this party, who himself was a self-identified Urning, and extracted the piece of glass that had been left inside of him. The young man suffered the most excruciating pains like a stoic without uttering a cry. His courage was indeed worthy of a better cause. And here we see on the left-hand side the burly doctor himself saying, I have done all I can for you. I'm afraid you must be transported to the hospital. And at the bottom, our injured man says, what? And expose myself to the sneers of all the nurses and doctors? Never. The next page it says he asked to be taken home because he was basically being treated on site, basically, by a friend who was at the party. He asked to be taken home, and there he begged to be left alone for half an hour. As soon as he was by himself, he locked the door of the room, took a revolver, and shot himself. The cause of the suicide remained a mystery to everybody except ourselves. This cast a dampness on all of us and for some time put an end to the symposiums. In other words, a person has been intended to by a practicing physician, but the mere thought of having to go to a clinic, to be treated in a way that would save his life, but to expose, because of the kind of injury, precisely the kind of pathological subject that he is, he chooses death by suicide, in fact, instead. My point is that it doesn't take long after the pathologization of these categories to know that the clinic is where they're supposed to be treated for the intimidation to come up, to rise up in some way. And in fact, it's that intimidation, maybe not to the point of causing suicide, but that causes us to have pause sometimes when we think about where LGBT meets medicine. Let me give you a couple more people. This is Richard von Krafft-Ebing. He's also a leading Austro-German. In his case, he's a psychiatrist and a physician. And he's a proponent for the medicalization of what's going to be called the third sex. The term he likes to use to talk about homosexuality is invert, as a biological anomaly. You'll note that that word invert sounds like pervert, and that's because of the fact that it's trying to maybe distort the idea, the question of there's nothing perverted about a person, say, who has same-sex attraction. Their attraction is just in some way inverted towards same-like bodies or selves. He's also the person who coined the terms like bisexual and masochist, and his most famous text is called the Psychoanalysis, which was first published in German in 1886. Karl Havelock Ellis is our first English physician or social progressive who was very interested in both psychiatric and somatic etiologies for homosexuality and other conditions of gender and sexual non-normativity. He's one of the first specialists on transgenderism. He writes the first lengthy studies of what's going to be called the third sex, and I'll tell you about that term in just a second. His most famous text that he wrote It was his first that he wrote in English on the subject. He wrote it with the poet and philosopher J.A. Symonds, who wrote several philosophical treatises about same-sex affection. In fact, one of his most famous is called A Problem in Greek Philosophy, or A Problem in Greek Ethics, and it's this very notion of pederasty or same-sex affection in the classical world. Sexual inversion is the text he wrote. Let me give you some other examples from literature real quick, too. This is one of the first novels that was published in English about homosexuality, where the homosexual is the protagonist. It's by the novelist D.M. Forster. Some of you may be familiar with novels he wrote that were quite fondly made into movie adaptations quite regularly in the 80s and 90s, such as A Room with a View, or Howard's End, or A Passage to India. One of his lesser-known books is called Morris, which is the sort of English pronunciation of Maurice. He wrote this book in 1914, Forster did, and the book wasn't published until 1971, so speaking about collapsing time between the early turn of the century and the 70s, which is what this morning is all about, this novel does exactly that. It was written in 1914, and the reason Forster wrote it, one, is because he wanted to write a book that had people who identified as same-sex attracted as the protagonists, and he wanted the book to have a happy ending. In fact, the dedication of the book wasn't to a friend or a colleague or a lover, it was just dedicated to a happier year. That's all that it said. Now, he suppressed the book's publication for this almost the same reason as he was inspired to write it. He wanted it to have gay protagonists, and he wanted to have a happy ending. And he didn't want it published because he didn't think anybody would believe it, that there could be a happy ending for these characters in some way. It's significant, then, that he would choose to have the book, or that his estate would choose to publish it within a year after he passed away. So it wasn't published in 71, as though the 70s were going to be that happier year. In fact, a lot of what I'm going to talk about the rest of the day, the morning, is about whether it was or wasn't, and what constitutes that happier year. This is a quote from I'd say about a third of the way through the book. By this point, he's determined that he's attracted to other men, has known for some time. He's acted on it, but he can't seem to suppress it as hard as he might try. He's fallen in love at least once, and it's broken his heart because there seems to be no place to land in the world as a practicing same-sex attracted person. So he thinks that the best solution, and by the way, his father passed away when he was a child, so he thinks the next best fatherly figure, their family friend, will be the best choice. And this is a family friend by the name of Dr. Barry. Just so happens that he also thinks a doctor might be a good idea, who to talk about his problem, condition. Note, this kind of prose would have been impossible to imagine 25 years prior to this. So this is the first solution, so to speak. Morris, loathed the idea of a doctor, but he had failed to kill lust single-handed. As crude as in his boyhood, it was many times as strong and raged his empty soul. He might keep away from young men, as he had naively resolved, but he could not keep away from their images, and hourly committed sin in his heart. Any punishment was preferable, for he assumed a doctor would punish him. He could undergo any course of treatment on the chance of being cured, and even if he wasn't, he would be occupied and have fewer minutes for brooding. So this is, again, that hesitation to see a doctor, and yet that pressure to feel like that's the solution in this particular world. He decides to go see his friend, Dr. Barry, his fatherly figure in the family. When he goes to see him, he tells Dr. Barry, and this says just prior to this little scene I'm going to read for you, Dr. Barry comes and he asks to see him in private, and he starts to sob, and the doctor says, "What's wrong?" And he refers to himself, and he says, "I'm an unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde sort." That's how he describes himself, which is interesting because on the one hand he references the unspeakable, and on the other hand references a very recent historical figure with which we would reveal our attraction. The novel comes out in 1914, and that's less than 20 years after Wilde himself was tried, prosecuted, and sent to Reading jail for sodomy acts. He says to Dr. Barry, "Dr. Barry, I can't have explained." And the doctor says, "Now listen to me, Morris. Never let that evil hallucination, that temptation from the devil occur to you again." The voice impressed him. The italics in blue are my highlights, but notice the emphasis on the language. The voice impressed him, and was not science speaking. "Who put that lie in your head? You whom I see and know to be a decent fellow? We'll never mention it again. No, I'll not discuss it. I'll not discuss. The worst thing I could do for you is to discuss it." "I want advice," said Morris, struggling against the overwhelming manner. "It's not rubbish to me, but my life." "Rubbish," came the voice authoritatively. "I've been like this ever since I can remember without knowing why. What is it? Am I diseased? If I am, I want to be cured. I can't put up with the loneliness anymore, the last 6 months especially. Anything you tell me, I'll do. That's all. You must help me." He fell back into his original position, gazing body and soul into the fire. "Come dress yourself." "I'm sorry," he murmured and obeyed. Then Dr. Barry unlocked the door and called, "Polly, whiskey." The consultation was over. So the silencing here is significant here. If medicine coined terms like homosexuality and transsexuality, it seems to be the discursive solution. This is part of one of those things where if medicine was the first thing to pathologize homosexuality and transsexuality and other LGBT categories, it also created the sense of personhood and language, too. To that end, there's a troubling sort of relationship that happens between whether medicine is supposed to be the thing that you run to for rescue, or it's the thing that in some way disempowers you at a certain time. To that end, voice and discourse and terminology are sort of a lot of the name of the games in terms of thinking about homosexuality. I said that the unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde sort was how Morris refers to himself. He doesn't want to use the word homosexual, even though we know he knows it in the novel. He says, "I'm an unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde sort." If you don't know Oscar Wilde, when he was imprisoned, his lover at the time was named Lord Alfred Douglas, who was most famous for a poem he wrote called Two Loves, that has a line in it, "The love that dare not speak its name," which, as we know, is another euphemism for homosexuality historically. So the speaking and not speaking, the uttering and not uttering, the naming and not naming seems to at once be the history of LGBT people, but also in their relationship to science and medicine. Magnus Hirschfeld might be our most famous sexologist who's working in the areas of LGBT, or what would later be called LGBT studies. He was a Germano-Prussian sexologist, and he advocated for the scientific study alongside social progress of these individuals. Not unlike Karl Ulrichs, who appeared probably 25 or 30 years earlier, his work was obsessed with, at once, creating a nosological and categorical framework with which to articulate the range, the panoply of gender and sexual non-normativities, but alongside it to found organizations that could advocate for the legal and sort of justice protections of people that fell into these categories. He founded the first Institute for Sexual Research in the world in 1919 in Berlin. Significantly, a few years prior, he had founded the first organization that was ever a gay, what we now call gay, lesbian, and trans rights group, and it was called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. Two words to note in there big time is the first one, science. Science is going to be the liberator, if you will, for the injustices that are faced by LGBT people. It's interesting that this conference today is very much about how does science and medicine actually only reveal the injustices sometimes that might exist for LGBT people, how does it not solve them? But I want you to pay attention to that word humanitarian there as well, too. I told you that science migrated the practice or the offense of sodomy over into a personhood and identity. The emphasis on humanity and totality of humanness is not lost on me in the way this category was named, this group was named. In the same way that the largest lobbying group in the United States for LGBT rights is the Human Rights Campaign. So this idea of wanting to think about humanity as a totality in some way in the face of injustice in terms of LGBT persons is both where the scientific attempt to rescue sodomites comes from, but it's a place we still groove politically in terms of how we articulate LGBT identity. The bottom is a list of it's the first film ever that had a protagonist who was gay in it. It was called Different from the Others. Magnus Hirschfeld helped co-write and also produce the movie, and also cast himself in the movie as a Germano-Prussian sexologist. So he basically plays himself in the movie. Basically, I want you to know this about all of these scientists. They're all working in different fields. Some of them working in psychiatry, some of them working in sexology, some of them are working in hormonal studies. Quite a few of them are working on anatomy or neuroanatomy. These will be 20th century long fascinations of LGBT persons. But it comes down to what was a Victorian, Edwardian, and early 20th century sort of appreciation of what to do with sexual and gender non-normative persons. Traditionally, science had ascribed that there were just two sexes. The first sex, of course, the most important one, the male sex, the heterosexual male sex, the cisgender heterosexual male sex. If everybody knows what I mean by cisgender, it means, absolutely the matching up of masculinity and maleness, your sex and your gender positively being nothing irrefutable there. So our most traditional heteronormative male is the first sex. Second sex, I think we're all familiar with that term much more thanks to Simone de Beauvoir. The second sex is the female heterosexual or heteronormative sex. But everything else, the same-sex attracted male person, the same-sex attracted female person, the gender non-normative female, the gender non-normative male, the intersex person, the person who is transvestite or transgender or transsexual, the person born with ambiguous genitalia or with an adrenal condition that manifests itself in some indefinable way, these all fall into what was called the third sex, a kind of others category. Categories that fell within the third sex that were literal terms created by science and medicine to fit in that category that still exist with us today are ones like homosexual, bisexual, transsexual, transvestite, sadist, masochist, exhibitionist, fetishist. This list could go on for pages and pages, by the way, but note that these are terms that all of them come out of science and medicine. They don't exist until sexology comes along and coins them, which is significant. Because if you've been to the William Way Center, if you've been on a university campus like mine has an LGBTQI center, many of them have the LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQI, LGBTQII, LGBTQIA. The letters keep going, right? Because it's endless how many people that can fall in those categories. But so many of them come from this scientific discourse. So if you want to think about one of the legacies and one of the intimidations that exists in contemporary science and medicine, what does it mean when individuals who are part of a community and that identify themselves in the very language they use to identify themselves comes out of pathology? How, even despite our best intentions to liberate or demedicalize, does it become immaterial because of the fact that the terms themselves are tethered, maybe? We can try to elevate, we can try to liberate, but there's always a tether that seems to be to science and medicine. I'll give you an example of how gender and sexual non-normativity have been appreciated in science and medicine in ways that are difficult. And this goes for trans persons, gay persons, lesbians. But I'm going to take the historical example of what was called the hermaphrodite. Now, that term had existed for a long time because human bodies that didn't seem to line up exactly to what an entirely male or an entirely female body have been around for a long time. So being born with, as I said, ambiguous genitalia, being born with genitalia that are particularly small in size or enlarged in size that don't match up, being born with an adrenal condition or hormonal condition that suggests a combination of sexual expressions in some particular way. Even an individual historically that would have identified different than the gender that they were first described at birth or in their name or dress or performance, we would now call transgender, but that could still fall under a hermaphrodite in historical terms. But what people who fell into the third sex were often categorized as not just being distorted or perverted or sometimes inverted from those first two traditional binary categories. They were also described as though being sort of catch-22, caught at both ends of the extreme of not sort of being taken care of or understood entirely. So in the case of the hermaphrodite, a medical scientist would probably say something like, for example, you're not an entire man and you're not an entire woman. You're incomplete on both categories. And so in that sense, there's not enough sex to you. There's not enough to describe you as a full person. On the flip side, they might say, you've got parts or expressions to you that seem male, and you have parts and expressions that seem to you as female. You have too much sex or too much gender inside of you. Appreciations of the third sex were people falling into that category, not just because they didn't live up to the very prescribed and prescriptive first two categories, but because they either suggested a kind of either insufficiency or an excess when it came to sexuality. So it's not just the disturbance, it's in some way the glass is either half full or it runneth over, but either way it doesn't fit in the two categories that we have. Let me take you just a couple more examples before I wrap up, so in case you have a couple questions, and I know that a lot of the themes I'm introducing are going to be sort of resurrected in their own right throughout the rest of the day. Freud might be one of our most famous people we know who deals with this work. When he comes along in about the early part of the 20th century, and then by the time we get to, say, sort of like the teens and 20s, his 3 essays on the theories of sexuality was one of his first most famous texts. We start to see that while sexology and neuroanatomy and hormonal studies and many different disciplines are weighing in on not just the genesis or the etiology of homosexuality in various categories of gender and sexual non-normativity, but the treatment of those categories, it's really in psychoanalysis and the talking cure and therapy that we're seeing by mid-20th century the most consistent attention to how do we sublimate or how do we treat homosexuality or same-sex affection. He's a proponent of the talking cure. Therapy is a way of performing a discursive sort of cure for isolating and treating and tending to crisis. Developed the idea of homosexuality as a developmental anomaly and the notions of latency and sublimation, and actually the potential that they could be futile. In other words, is our goal to sublimate desire, or is that an impossibility? Freud proponed both of these ideas at different points in his career. An important thing to note, though, is that his consideration of homosexuality and bisexuality as parts of a developmental anomaly suggests then that in some ways attractions to the same sex or attractions to both sex or just a fluidity in sexual attraction is actually just a normal anomaly in the human condition that maybe perhaps we all express at some point in our young development. It's just to see it manifest consistently and permanently in the adult figure is atypical. A most common example we see of this is something like people talking about arrested development theory, this idea that we all go through stages of anal fixation or oral fixation, and by extension, attractions to or unattractions to persons of the same sex or different sex. A back of the envelope, and Freud would later disassociate himself from the arrested development theory, but it's a big part of psychoanalysis and psychiatric history, would be, we all go through homosocial stages where we, a young girl says, boys are gross, and the boy has the sign on that no girls allowed. I mean, this idea that there's definite periods where we feel drawn to or not drawn to different genders or body types. The problem with the condition with the person who, let's say, has same-sex affections, homosexual, according to this theory, is that in attempting to grow up, you plateau and you start growing sideways, as one theorist put it in some way. To that end, what you have then is a theory and a logic behind a lot of psychoanalytic discourse historically that it's not just pathologized homosexuality and advocated for its sublimation, but that has articulated in some way that to be homosexual, if it's just a normal anomaly in the human condition, means that, in my case, I never got out of the 10-year-old stage I was supposed to be in certain things. What that's left, though, actually is a lingering example of where one ways in which, and I say this as I do LGBT bioethics now, how are LGBT persons treated in clinical, medical, and research practice? There is a recurrent infantilization of LGBT persons in science and medicine. I can't tell you how many times I've been called in for cases or consultation where there's something to the extent of two same-sex partners have been called in and one person is infirmed and can't make a decision for whatever permanent or impermanent incapacitation, and their partner with decision-making rights makes a choice, and the clinical team calls me and says, don't you think we should ask his parents what he wants to do? They would never do that to a straight couple, ever. And again it happens. Let's take, since we're here in the Pennsylvania Historical Society, if you've seen this film, the famous film about this town, Philadelphia, the main character, and he's, of course, a suburban, mainline, affluent, Ivy League graduate, white, Tom Hanks. Oh my, by God, they're going to make you like this guy by the end of the movie, aren't they? Do you remember what the movie ends on? It ends on his parents. It ends on his family and friends. They're having a sort of memorial for him. And it cuts through the crowd, and it shows all the loving and the diversity and the this and the that and whatever. And the last thing it closes in on is the TV screen showing home movies of him when he's about 3 years old. Which is to say, if I haven't got you because it's Tom Hanks, and he's white and he's rich, and he's from Philadelphia, he's from the mainland or whatever, by God, I'm going to pull out the baby book, There's an attempt to want to think about LGBT persons as being at their most sympathetic sometimes when they are leaning towards this arrested development sort of moment. And a lot of the rights that we advocate for LGBT persons are the right to autonomy, the right to maturity, the right to adulthood, the right to having the same respect and the same authority that any other adult would have in the medical practice. Kinsey is one of our other major figures that we have here in American history. He talked a lot about the human variety of sexual variety as well. He's very famous for his Kinsey scale, which you may have heard of. It's a variation on this idea of we all have certain latent sort of, or different periods we're attracted to or not attracted to. Kinsey would argue, rather than that everybody goes through certain homosocial or bisocial sort of stages, he would just argue that there is a pretty balanced spectrum between people who are 100% homosexual and 100% heterosexual, and there's the variation and gradations all within between, how we believe, how we act, who we're attracted to. It's a permutation on the idea of trying to think about sexual attraction as being not just fixed and marked in two single categories of male and female heterosexual cisgender identity, but as being something that has a spectrum to it. But let me tell you about this, and this is one of the things that I work on my theory as a historian of medicine. It says at the top of this page, the painful reunion. That's kind of what this entire day is about. And why I've lingered on the early 19th century is to give you a rough back of the envelope of what some of these things have meant for the LGBT community. This is for a piece I wrote in the Journal of Bioethical Inquiry a couple of years ago. And it's a timeline that, and you can look briefly at the dates to the left-hand side over here, that says, in the late 1860s is when we had the first instances of, say, the use of the term homosexual. By the 1890s, all the way through about the 1960s, categories like homosexual and lesbian and transgender and bisexual, they're migrating through different discourses of psychoanalysis and sexology, hormonal studies and theory, all different places, where the seeding of questions about how do you cure and what makes people gay are being asked in lots of different medical spheres. But it is medicine that is being the arbiter, basically, of how do we define these categories. By the 60s, with the rise of second-wave feminism, second-wave gay rights, first-wave feminism, of course, as we know, is more of the suffragette sort of era, temperance sort of movement. First-wave gay rights is actually Magnus Hirschfeld, and I showed you that Scientific Humanitarian Committee. But with the post-Second World War and the rise of second wave feminism, second wave gay rights, civil rights, and human rights, we see a amalgamation of LGBT persons and the rise of gay metropolises in the states really mobilizing a lot of the political activity, a lot of what we're talking about here for the Pennsylvania Historical Society today. One of the big dates that's going to be talked about in the 70s, and I just am gesturing to it now so you can see it in a larger cascade of what these dates sort of mean together, is 1973. This is the year that homosexuality is removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. The term still lingers in the DSM after that, but only in rather qualifying sort of ways. So you might have a condition like ego-dystonic personality disorder with homosexual manifestation, or suicidal tendencies caused by extreme depression brought on by homosexuality. But homosexuality itself, full stop, being a category of mental aberration or illness, it's pressure. It's civil rights. It's pressure from a community that's mobilizing that makes it possible. Now, what this is supposed to have signaled, and you can read lots of materials, media coverage in gay press in the 1970s, that's just sort of like, we are going to start divorcing ourselves from science and medicine. They may have given us our terms, and they may have created the pathology that surrounds us, but it's time for these two things to part, is basically what it is. But the 1973 removal of homosexuality was supposed to be the beginning of a whole host of measures that was supposed to take LGBT persons as far away from medicine, that the default instinctive reaction wasn't to think LGBT, go see a doctor. Morris, go see a doctor. You're sick, go see a doctor. Now what happens, of course, is that 73 is the year that the DSM decides, the term is removed from the DSM by the American Psychiatric Association. And 1981 is the year that we first start talking about HIV and AIDS in mainstream and medical press. The disease most certainly had been around before then, but we're talking about less than a decade between when you were supposed to have been liberating yourself from science and medicine and when suddenly you're having the greatest epidemiological disaster ever in your community too. What you've got then actually, and this is actually the DSM from 1973, which we'll hear more about. Notice at the bottom on the left-hand side, it says sexual orientation disturbance, and then in parentheses it says homosexuality. Essentially it says, this diagnosis is distinguished from homosexuality, which by itself does not constitute a psychiatric disorder anymore, basically is what it means. If you notice in the upper right-hand side, we have a list of continuing texts inside the DSM on this edition. This is the 1973 DSM-3. Fetishism, pedophilia, transvestitism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, sadism, masochism. This is our list that comes from sexology, all of these terms and categories. Homosexuality may be starting to be removed from the DSM in this year, but a whole host of sexological categories in the past are still there. And some still are to this day. This was the itinerary I told you about, to have been freed out and oppressed in the 50s, freed in the 60s, exalted in the 70s, quick itinerary. But even when we go back to the end of the 19th century and think about the genesis of these terms at that time, this is still a quick itinerary. To have been no more than 145 years ago, and I'll point to myself because I love to use myself as an example, but that I could only be understood as a sinner or a criminal up until about 140 years ago. Now when suddenly I can be understood and largely am as being someone who's sick, then, not just 40 or 50 years ago, I'm trying to liberate myself from the sick, and yet then another illness comes that brings on great necessity in my community. This is a lot of the arcs, significant. White is talking about from the 50s to the 80s, but we could say that as well about the last 150 years, which is basically when homosexuality and medicine have been talked about and articulated. The stakes for LGBT health then, in the past, in the present, and in the future, are the legacy of being haunted by this past and knowing that much of it is still with us. It is a coexistence of clinical suspicion, clinical intimidation, but also clinical necessity. What HIV and AIDS basically brought on was this idea that, and I say this a lot, if HIV and AIDS, I get asked sometimes, if HIV and AIDS had never come along, would LGBT persons not have to face this thing I call this painful reunion, this I want nothing else to do with medicine, and then, oh shit, we gotta get right back together again because we need it. And the truth is, LGBT persons, and I'm gesturing towards that human concept, are just human beings like everybody else. We all get sick at some point. We all have loved ones that we need to care for, people we need to tend to. We all die at some point. What HIV and AIDS forced in some way was the mass migration back to the clinic in some way, in a way that if we tried to liberate through our activism to get us away from medicine by the 70s, life, a new disease on the platform, forced us as a collective to move back in some way. To that end, the reconciliation that comes with the reunion, in fact, a leading theorist in AIDS studies, she was one of my dissertation advisors on this. I said it was supposed to be like a divorce and led to a painful reunion. She said, you really should think about maybe terming it something more like a trial separation, which is basically what happened between LGBT persons sort of in medicine in the 70s. And it is true. Most times you hear about people who have a trial separation, and a lot of times you just think, I give them 6 months and they're done, trial separations. But sometimes you come back together, and sometimes you're more fortified. Sometimes that relation comes back because of the fact that things are going to be different. In fact, the truth is, historically, one thing that the painful reunion of bringing LGBT persons back to medicine brought was the very use of the term, and the very twist in politics is the birth of the queer person that made possible that moment. One brought on by clinical challenge and difficulty. A leading theorist in queer studies wrote in 1990 about this terminological legacy and also the intimidations of how going forward we're supposed to understand and appreciate that it's not mere semantics, but the discursive stakes of naming, pathologizing, categorizing, having a text in a certain book or not having a text in a certain book, having a certain pathological discourse for it or not having it. These are conversations that maybe aren't dangerous for the conversations themselves, but who are the parties that get to be involved? Maybe it isn't terrible that there were juridical forms of talking about same-sex affection, because I'll be honest with you, you read any same-sex attracted literature sort of before the late 19th century, most of them are loving texts that talk about it, because I'd rather hear sort of harsh things sometimes about who I think I am than nothing at all. So maybe juridical discourse has a place in the past. Maybe pathological discourse has a place in the past and the future. But maybe a lot more versions do too of forms of discourse and discussion. Treichler says here, Paul Treichler, we cannot afford to let scientists or historians or any other group of experts dismiss our meanings as misconceptions and our alternative views as noise that interferes with the pure processes of scientific inquiry. Rather, we need to insist that many voices contribute to the construction of official definitions, and specifically certain voices that need urgently to be heard. To that end, I've told you that I tried to share with you some of the history being a very terminological one and a very discursive one, and one that tries to use pathology as a tool to liberate from judgment, and yet the endurance of stigma, despite the realm, necessitates that what's valuable here isn't necessarily the shutting down of any of these kinds of conversations. It's making sure that all of the parties contribute to them, especially LGBT persons themselves. Thanks.